Shane Sharp here, and now I would like to discuss with you the social psychology of social cognition and perception. Social psychologists are interested in how the social world influences people's thinking. However, while the social world is an objective reality that influences people's behavior, people rarely think about or see the social world in an objective manner. Rather, people's cognitions, or the various mental processes that make up the human mind, and perceptions, or how people view the world through information they take in through their senses, or through their eyes and ears, influences people's interpretations of other people in the social world. Social psychologists find that humans' mental processes or cognitions influence how people think about the social world. It does so through what social psychologists call schematic processing. Schematic processing refers to the use of schemas to organize sensory information. Schemas are organized sets of thoughts about particular objects. Schemas usually include information about objects' characteristics and how it is related to other objects. For example, mothers are related to fathers, sons, daughters. Most of you, for example, have a schema for the typical NIU undergraduate student. This schema would include information about the typical NIU student, such as the typical age, state of residency, and general intelligence level of an NIU student. Another example. Most people in the United States have a schema about a physician. Such a schema would include various characteristics and attributes that most people associate with physicians, such as high intelligence, high status, and high income. Of course, we are not born with any schemas. So, where do they come from? According to social psychologists, people's schemas come from a variety of sources, all of which are interrelated. The first source of schemas is socialization. Adult caregivers, teachers, and the mass media teach people what the typical attributes and characteristics of objects are. For example, people often learn what the typical attributes and characteristics of a musician are by what their parents tell them about musicians. The second source of schemas is mass media. People learn schemas about certain objects, such as funerals, business people, and mothers, because of their exposure to the mass media. For example, even though many people have never met the President of the United States, people still have a schema for the President because people form a schema of the President based on how he is portrayed in the mass media, both real and fictional. The third source of schemas is people's actual experience. Once people have had some sort of personal experience with some object, they develop schemas of those objects. For example, a person's schema for a professor changes once they have actually met a professor. Humans think using schemas. But why is this? According to social psychologists, people think using schemas because there are several advantages to schematic processing. First, using schemas simplifies a very complicated reality. People are bombarded by stimuli constantly. All the stimuli that people experience at one time is infinitely complex. However, human cognitive processing is limited, and to take in all the stimuli into awareness at one time would overwhelm people. Schemas help people deal with all the stimuli by putting it into manageable chunks, so to speak, by filtering out stimuli that isn't important for the task at hand, and helping people focus on stimuli that are important for the task at hand. A second advantage of schematic processing is that schemas aid people's memory. Human memory is inherently limited, and because of the complicated nature of reality, a person remembering all the stimuli that she has been exposed to in a single day would overwhelm her and cause her to forget everything she's remembered in the past. Schemas aid people's memory because causing people to remember only relevant information about an object that has to do with the schema for that object. For example, having a schema for a wedding ceremony helps people remember things about this event that are important to remember, such as what the bride wore, what was said during the vows, etc. A third advantage of schematic processing is that schemas help people draw inferences about objects based on the schemas that people have about these objects. For example, most people would not approach an undergraduate student for legitimate medical advice. This is because people's schemas about undergraduate students help people infer that these sorts of individuals probably don't have any training in medicine. Schematic processing, however, is a double-edged sword. While there are obvious advantages to schematic processing, social psychologists have also discovered several disadvantages to this way of thinking. First, schemas can cause perceptual biases, or biases in how people see and interpret the world. Social psychologists have found that people often attend to and remember stimuli about an object that is in line with their schemas for these objects. We see this all the time regarding polarizing figures in U.S. politics and popular culture. People often form positive or negative schemas about politicians and celebrities. Once this happens, people tend to attend to and remember things about these people that support the schemas that they have formed of these people. For instance, let's say that a person has formed a negative schema of Kanye West. Once this has occurred, this person is more likely to attend to and remember the bad things Kanye West does and ignore and forget the good things that he does. A second disadvantage to schematic processing is that schemas often remain even after people receive disconfirming evidence for particular schemas. This is called the perseverance effect, because schemas tend to persevere despite evidence that they are wrong. For example, most people's schemas for a librarian don't include loving heavy metal. However, even if a person met several librarians who loved heavy metal, his schema for a librarian probably won't change to include the love of heavy metal. A third disadvantage to schematic processing is that schemas cause people to sometimes draw erroneous inferences about objects. For example, most people's schemas for professors includes the idea that professors like listening to classical music rather than heavy metal. While this is the case for many professors, that's not the case for all professors. I personally know many professors who would rather listen to Pantera or Slayer than to Mozart or Beethoven. A fourth disadvantage to schematic processing is that schemas cause people to seek out information that will confirm their schemas. This is called the confirmation bias. Basically, people tend to want to maintain the schemas that they have, and thus they seek out information about objects that will confirm their schemas about these objects. For example, since most people's schemas about librarians don't include liking heavy metal, most people would never ask a librarian if they've heard the latest Metallica or Megadeth or Slayer album. Thus, because of the way that they interact with others, people can confirm their schemas about others. Now, the social world is full of ambiguous information, and so the ways people interpret this information often depends on what schemas people use to interpret this information. For example, imagine that a person's riding on the L in Chicago and sees another person muttering to himself in an incoherent way, rocking back and forth in his seat, and hassling adjacent passengers. This man's behavior could be interpreted in a variety of ways. For example, some people might think this man is drunk. Other people might think that he's suffering from a mental illness. And others might just think he's just a marble-mouthed jerk. Thus, the question that needs answering is what determines which schemas people will use to interpret the information that they take in from their senses. Social psychologists find that, for the most part, people use schemas that are the most accessible to them. That is, people are most likely to use schemas to interpret information that are at the forefront of their mind. The accessibility of schemas is influenced by three factors. First, schemas that people have constantly used in the past are more accessible than schemas that people don't use very often. For example, if there is a history of alcoholism in someone's family, the schema of a drunk or an alcoholic is going to be very accessible to them. Because of this, this person would most likely interpret the man on the L's behavior as being drunk. However, if there is a lot of mental illness in a person's family, she would have the schema of a mentally ill person readily accessible to her, and thus would be more likely to interpret the man on the L's behavior as mental illness. Second, schemas are more accessible when these schemas are related to a current goal that a person is trying to achieve. For instance, suppose that a person is taking an abnormal psychology class where she learns all about mental illnesses such as depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Because this person is taking this class, the schemas related to mental illness are readily accessible to this person, and she begins to interpret people's ambiguous behavior as signs of mental illness. Thus, because this person has mental illness schemas accessible because she's taken a normal psychology course, she is likely to interpret the man on the L's behavior as symptoms of mental illness. Finally, social psychologists find that schemas are more accessible and thus more likely to be used to interpret ambiguous information when these schemas have been primed. This is called the priming effect. The priming effect is when recent experiences increase the accessibility of a schema and thus influence people's judgment. This means that a particular schema is not always accessible, but becomes primed by something a person's been thinking about or doing before encountering an ambiguous event. For instance, if a person had been out drinking the other night and saw a bunch of really drunk people and behavior, the schema of a drunk person would be highly accessible to them. Thus, he would be more likely to interpret the man on the L's behavior as being drunk. While most people have thousands of schemas, these schemas nevertheless fall into particular types. According to social psychologists, there are several types of schemas, including person schemas, role schemas, scripts, and stereotypes. The first type of schemas is person schemas. These are schemas people have regarding specific people. For example, you all have a specific schema for your particular mother, your particular father, your particular aunt or uncle, best friend. The second type of schemas is role schemas. These are the thoughts and beliefs about the attributes and characteristics of people who occupy particular roles in a society. Most people in American society have particular ideas about what a mother, a father, a sibling, a student, an employee, and a senator have. For example, most people have a schema for mother, and this schema includes ideas that mothers are caring, nurturing, and loving. The third type of schemas is scripts. These are schemas regarding recurrent social events and situations. Scripts define the normal sequence of events, the persons participating in the event, and the activities that constitute the event. For example, many people have a script for a wedding. They know how weddings proceed, what happens after a wedding, and who are the main participants of the wedding. For example, the bride and groom, groomsmen, bridesmaids, and officiators. The fourth type of schemas is stereotypes. These are schemas regarding the typical behavior and characteristics of members of particular groups. Examples of stereotypes include Irish people drink a lot, or all Southerners are dim-witted racists, or all Asians are good at math. These are all stereotypes because these statements assume that all the individuals who belong to these groups share particular characteristics and attributes. As these examples suggest, stereotypes can be both positive and negative. People's stereotypes come from a variety of sources. The first source of stereotypes is personal experience. If a person meets one dim-witted racist Southerner, they might come to assume that all Southerners are dim-witted and racist, even though that is far from the case. A second source of stereotypes is popular culture. For example, many people learn the stereotype that Asians are good at math from the mass media. A third source of stereotypes is biased distribution of particular types of people into particular types of roles. For example, people in American society often believe that women are more nurturing. However, this idea may be because women are concentrated in roles, such as mothers, caregivers, and nurses, that call for nurturing behavior. If a social group is concentrated into roles with negative characteristics, then these negative characteristics may lead to unflattering stereotypes. An interesting example of this stereotype is the stereotype of Jews as greedy and good with money. This negative stereotype originated from the fact that in much of Europe during the Middle Ages, Jews were not allowed to own land, and thus they could not farm. They had to find other ways to survive, and so many Jews became bankers and merchants. Also, consider the stereotype that blacks are lazy. Yes, there is high unemployment among blacks in the United States, but this is usually because of racial discriminatory practices that prevent blacks from getting jobs, and because blacks often live in poor areas that don't have many opportunities for employment because of racist residential segregation. Social psychologists find that stereotypes cause several cognitive errors. First, stereotypes cause people to assume that everyone in a social group is exactly the same. The idea that everyone in a social group shares the exact same attributes and characteristics, however, is 99.9999% of the time incorrect. For example, while there is the stereotype that Southerners are dim-witted and racist, this is by no means characterizes everyone who lives in the South. Sure, there are dim-witted racists who live in the South, but there are also many brilliant and non-racist people who live in the South. Also, while some Asians are good at math, not all of them are. There are many Asians who would have trouble doing a simple arithmetic problem. It is very hard to believe that billions of people, all of them, are good at math or any particular task just because of one's race or ethnic background. A second error caused by stereotypes is that they cause people to overestimate the differences between social groups. For example, most people have a stereotype of a figure skater and a stereotype for a football player. Because of the stereotypes that people have for these type of people, most people assume that figure skaters and football players share nothing in common. One skates delicately on ice in front of judges while the other gets pounded trying to get the ball in an end zone or to stop another from getting there. However, figure skaters and football players actually share a lot in common. Both are dedicated, both are hardworking, both are athletic. A third error caused by stereotypes is that they often lead people to make incorrect inferences because the stereotypes are based on incorrect information. In other words, it makes people come to wrong conclusions about people because there is no factual basis for the stereotype. For example, the stereotype that all Asians are good at math has no basis in reality, since not all Asians are good at math. Social psychologists have also found that stereotypes can lead to negative consequences for those who are stereotyped. The first and most obvious way that this occurs is through discrimination. People often discriminate against others because of the stereotypes they have for these others. For instance, sociologists find that women are often discriminated against in business and engineering firms because of the common stereotype that women aren't good at math and lack the ruthless motivation that a person needs to succeed in business. A second negative consequence of stereotypes for those stereotyped is that stereotypes provide people with justifications for disliking particular social groups. This justification for disliking can lead to negative consequences for particular social groups. For example, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were negatively stereotyped as being greedy individuals who were a financial and moral drain on the German nation. This negative stereotype justified hating Jewish people, which eventually contributed to the killing of around 6 million Jews during the Jewish Holocaust. Concerning the last point, social psychologists have also shown that stereotypes can kill. Of course, stereotypes don't kill themselves, but rather they provide the motivations and justifications for people to do hurtful things to individuals who belong to these negatively stereotyped social groups. For example, social psychologists have found that Americans tend to have the stereotype that black men in general are more prone to crime and violence. This is probably due to all the media images from the news, television programs, and movies that portray black men as criminals. Of course, while some black men do perform criminal behavior, not all of them do. Social psychologists have also shown that people perceive blacks who look more stereotypically black, for example, have a broad nose, thick lips, dark skin, as more criminal than they actually are. For example, consider the two pictures of black men here. These are two pictures of college students who have never been convicted of a crime. When social psychologists ask people to point out the one they believe has committed a crime in the past, most of the time they point to the one on the right. This does have real-world consequences. Social psychologists have found that stereotypical looking blacks serve sentences on average 8 months longer than less stereotypical looking blacks. Also, social psychologists have analyzed actual capital murder cases and have shown that stereotypical looking blacks are more likely to receive death sentences in murder cases, even after controlling for aggravating circumstances, mitigating circumstances, murder severity, suspect's socioeconomic status, the victim's socioeconomic status, and the suspect's attractiveness. In another experiment that shows the potential lethality of stereotypes, researchers had non-black participants view photos of young men in realistic settings, such as in a park, a train station, or on a sidewalk. Half of the men in these photos were black, and the other half were white. Also, half of the men in each group were holding a handgun, and half were holding a non-threatening object, such as a cell phone or a camera. The researchers showed these pictures to the participants rapidly, and had them press a button labeled "Shoot" if they thought the man in the picture had a gun, and a button labeled "Don't shoot" if they thought the man did not. Participants won points for each round, modeled like a real first-person shooter video game, where people are rewarded for shooting the bad guy and penalized for shooting innocent civilians. As you can see from this graph, participants were more likely to shoot an unarmed black man in the mock video game than an unarmed white man. The researchers interpreted these results as individuals applying stereotypes in an unconscious way about dangerous black men, with the result of actually pulling the trigger when they saw an innocent black man. And, somewhat frighteningly, social psychologists have did the same experiment with actual police officers and found similar results. Social psychologists have found that stereotypes can be self-fulfilling. Social psychologists argue that stereotypes can be self-fulfilling because of what they call stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the anxiety members of a stereotype group experience when they believe they will be judged based on the common stereotype that other people have of their group. In short, stereotypes can be self-fulfilling because those who are stereotyped worry so much about fulfilling the stereotype that this worry causes them to actually act in ways that confirm the stereotype. According to social psychologists, the anxiety caused by stereotype threat causes stereotyped individuals to perform poorly at particular tasks, which can confirm these stereotypes. For example, there is a stereotype, which is completely unfounded, that blacks are less intelligent than whites. Because of this stereotype, black students that take academic and intelligence tests get nervous that they'll confirm this negative stereotype by doing poorly on these tests. This nervousness causes black students to do more poorly on these tests, since much of their cognitive energy is negatively affected by this nervousness. Stereotype threat was shown in an experiment where the researchers had white and black students of more or less equal intelligence take a version of an intelligence test. The researchers divided the participants into two groups. The first group was told the test would measure intelligence, and the second group was told that it was just part of a study to understand how people solve problems and that it didn't measure intelligence at all. The researchers told the first group that the test measured intelligence because they wanted to remind black participants of the negative stereotype that blacks are less intelligent than whites. The content of the test were the same for everyone. The researchers found that white participants and black participants performed the same when told that the test didn't measure intelligence. However, when told that the test did measure intelligence, the white participants did much better than the black participants. The researchers argued that because some of the black participants worried so much about confirming the stereotype that blacks aren't intelligent, this worry affected their test-taking ability by making them second-guess themselves and overthink the questions. Thus, worry over confirming a stereotype actually caused these participants to perform actions that provided evidence that the stereotype was actually true. Social psychologists have found that stereotype threat even occurs when they make up the stereotype. This was shown in an experiment where the researchers had college students take an intelligence test. In one condition, the researchers told the students that research showed that right-handers were more intelligent than left-handers. They were told that scientists believed that this was because of differences in how the right and left parts of the brain process information, which of course is totally false. There is no evidence whatsoever that left-handers are more or less intelligent than right-handers. The researchers reversed this for the other group, telling the participants that left-handers were more intelligent than right-handers. The researchers found that right-handers did much better on the test than left-handers when the researchers told the participants that right-handers were more intelligent. The pattern was completely reversed when the researchers told the participants that left-handers were more intelligent than right-handers. Now, one of the ways that social psychologists find that human mental processing influences how people interpret the social world is by influencing the perceptions that people have of others. In other words, human mental processing influences social perception. Social psychologists argue that there are two major ways in which human cognitive processes influence social perception: through impression formation and through making attributions about causes for behavior. One of the biggest ways that people's cognitive processes influence social perception is by influencing what social psychologists call impression formation. Impression formation refers to the cognitive process of organizing information about a person into an overall impression about that person. While forming impressions of others might seem like a straightforward task, human mental processing often gets in the way of forming accurate impressions of others. According to social psychologists, there are two main cognitive biases in forming impressions of others: trait centrality and the primacy effect. The first cognitive bias in forming impressions of others is trait centrality. Trait centrality is when a single trait of a person has an excessive effect on people's overall impression of this person. Social psychologists have found that certain traits, which they call central traits, greatly influence the other traits that people think others have. For instance, one central trait is whether a person is emotionally warm or emotionally cold. Several social psychologists have shown that this one trait can greatly influence the impressions people form of others. For example, in one experiment, the researcher told students in a social psychology class that there would be a guest lecturer to class today. Before the guest lecturer began, however, the researcher gave each student either one of two descriptions of the lecturer. The descriptions were exactly the same except for one thing. Some of the descriptions described the lecturer as cold, and the other description described him as warm. Here are the two descriptions given. As you see here, only one word is different. Half the people got the description of the lecturer. People who know him consider him to be a very warm person, industrious, critical, practical, and determined. The other half got the description, people who know him consider him to be a very cold person, industrious, critical, practical, and determined. After the guest lecturer finished his lecture, the researcher asked the students to rate the lecturer on specific traits. As you can see from this table, those who were told that the lecturer was cold rated the lecturer as more self-centered and more formal than those who were told that the lecturer was warm. Also, those who were told that the lecturer was cold rated the lecturer as less humane, less sociable, less popular, less good-natured, and less humorous than those who were told that the lecturer was warm. Such differences couldn't be due to the lecturer himself, since everyone was listening to his lecture at the same time. Rather, what occurred was that the initial description of the person as either warm or cold greatly influenced how people saw this person. Thus, trait centrality is one way that human cognitive processes can generally bias people's perceptions of other people. The phenomenon of trait centrality helps explain what social psychologists call the halo effect. The halo effect is the tendency to associate single positive personality traits and personal features with other positive traits and features. For example, social psychologists have found that physical attractiveness causes a halo effect. Social psychologists have found that beautiful people are seen as more socially desirable, as having better jobs, as being a good spouse, as being happy, and as more likely to be married than unattractive people, even though they have never actually met these people, but have only seen photographs of them. There is also a reverse halo effect, which is the tendency to associate single negative personality traits and features with other negative personality traits and features. This often occurs with negative stereotypes. For example, because of the negative stereotypes of blacks that exist in the United States, having black skin tone is a negative trait that people use to infer many other negative traits, such as criminality, aggression, and lack of intelligence. Social psychologists find that trait centrality occurs because people tend to have implicit personality theories. An implicit personality theory is the belief that certain personality traits and features are strongly associated with one another. For example, people rarely think that people who are boring are also popular. Also, the saying that blondes have more fun implies that individuals with blonde hair are fun-loving. Also, given all the dumb blonde jokes in American culture, there is the implicit assumption that blondes are less intelligent than people who have non-blonde hair. Here is an example of an implicit personality map developed by social psychologists. This map is based on two axes: whether a person is good or bad at being social, and whether a person is intelligent or not. As you can see here, certain traits are rarely associated with other traits. For example, people who are thought to be imaginative are also thought to be intelligent, and good in social settings. According to social psychologists, everyone has this map in their head, even though it is sort of subconscious. These maps influence the impressions people form of others all the time, which can sometimes lead people to incorrect conclusions about others. For example, you see here, when we think of an honest person, we also associate traits like modesty, tolerance, helpfulness, sincerity. But we really don't do traits like unsociable or cold or humorless, or even irresponsible, unreliable, superficial. They're too far apart from one another. The second cognitive bias in forming impressions of others is the primacy effect. The primacy effect is when people base the impressions they form of people more on information they receive first rather than information they receive later. In other words, social psychologists have found empirical support for the popular idea that first impressions are very important. The primacy effect was shown in an experiment where people observed another person taking a college aptitude test. In one condition, the test taker started out getting all the answers wrong, but progressively got better as he finished the test. In the other condition, the test taker started out missing answers but got progressively better as he completed the test. In both conditions, the test taker got about half the questions right. The researchers then asked the participants to rate the intelligence of the test taker and how well he would do on subsequent tests. Even though in both conditions the test taker got the same number of questions right, observers rated the test taker who started out strong but got weaker as more intelligent and much more likely to do well on future tests than the test taker who started out weak and then got stronger. In short, the participants of the study formed an impression of the test taker's intelligence more on information they learned earlier than they did later, supporting the idea of the primacy effect. According to social psychologists, the primacy effect occurs for two reasons. First, the primacy effect occurs because it causes biased subsequent attention to particular characteristics and attributes of another person. If people have formed an initial impression of another person, then they will pay attention to information that confirms this initial impression and ignore information that disconfirms this initial impression. For example, if a person forms an initial impression of another person as unintelligent, then he will pay attention to and more likely remember situations in which this person acted unintelligently, and ignore and forget situations in which this person demonstrated high intelligence. Second, the primacy effect occurs because it causes biased subsequent interpretations of people's behavior. Once people have formed an initial impression of a person from information they learned on first meeting this person, they will interpret the person's future behavior as evidence for this initial impression. For example, if a person forms an initial impression of another person as intelligent, she will interpret this person's future behavior as signs of his intelligence, even if to an outside observer some of this behavior may seem idiotic or stupid. Like stereotypes, often the impressions that people have of others can become self-fulfilling. This is called the Pygmalion effect. The Pygmalion effect got its name not from the Greek myth in which a sculptor falls in love with a statue he carved, but rather from the play Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. In this play, a linguistics professor in London bets that he can make a proper young lady out of a lower class girl from the street. He sets high expectations for this girl, and she eventually meets these expectations. In much the same way, if people form high expectations of others, these others will often live up to these high expectations. The Pygmalion effect was shown in an experiment where the researchers told teachers that they had done an IQ test on some of the students and found that some of the students were bright or intelligent and others not so much. They told the teachers the names of the students at the beginning of the year. However, the researchers actually didn't tell the teachers which students were intelligent and which were not so much. Rather, the researchers just randomly labeled some of the students as bright and others not so bright. They did this because they hypothesized that the teachers would form high expectations of students labeled bright and make this come true, so to speak, by interacting with and paying attention more to the students labeled bright, which studies have shown does increase cognitive development. At the end of the school year, the researchers came back and gave the children another IQ test. What they found confirmed their hypothesis. As you can see from this chart, the students the researchers told the teachers were bright scored higher on the IQ test later on in the year than those who weren't labeled bright. In short, the researchers found that just telling the teacher that a student was bright caused the teacher to interact more with the student and pay attention more to him, increasing the student's cognitive development. Another way that people's cognitive processes greatly influence social perception is by influencing the attributions people make of their and others' behavior, thoughts, and feelings. People often ask themselves the question, why did he or she do that? Or, why did I perform so poorly on this task? The answers to these questions are attributions, which are basically the believed causes of people's behavior and performances. While making attributions about people's behavior might seem like a straightforward task, social psychologists have found that human cognition often causes biases in the attributions people make. According to social psychologists, there are two general types of attributions: internal attributions and external attributions. Internal attributions are attributions citing factors internal within a person, such as willpower, personality, or intelligence. On the other hand, external attributions are attributions citing factors external to a person, such as the situation or social context. In other words, internal attributions find the causes of people's behavior within the individuals, and external attributions find the causes of people's behavior outside of the individuals. To see the differences between internal and external attributions, consider a person who claims that he is trying to quit smoking, but nevertheless is seen smoking by others. If people make an internal attribution about this person's behavior, they would say that this person was smoking because he has low willpower. However, if people made an external attribution about the smoker's behavior, they would say that the person is smoking because of the social pressure to smoke, or because the smoker is experiencing a lot of stress in life. Social psychologists have developed the principle of covariation to predict when people will make either an internal or external attribution. The principle of covariation is the idea that people make attributions by viewing what factors are present and what factors are absent when people perform specific actions. That is, people make attributions about people's behavior based on several observations over time, using what factors were and were not in the situations in which people acted in particular ways. The principle of covariation argues that attributions of a person's behavior are based on variations of three types of information: consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. Consensus is whether many people perform the behavior or just the person performs that behavior. If many people perform the behavior, then people tend to form external attributions. However, if just that one person performs the behavior, people tend to make internal attributions. Consistency is whether or not the person acts the same way in many different contexts and situations. If the person acts the same way in many different contexts and situations, then people tend to make internal attributions. However, if the person only acts in a particular way in a particular situation, then people tend to make external attributions. Distinctiveness is whether or not the person acts the same way toward one object as he or she does similar objects. If a person acts in a particular way just toward one type of object, then people tend to make external attributions. However, if the person tends to act the same way towards similar objects, then people tend to make internal attributions. According to the principle of covariation, people combine consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information to either make an internal attribution of the behavior, an external attribution toward the object of the behavior, or an external attribution toward the situation in which the behavior occurs. For example, let's say that some employees see their boss yell at one of their fellow employees, Tori. According to the principle of covariation, the employees will make an internal attribution, for example, that the boss is a belligerent ass, if consensus is low, distinctiveness is low, and consistency is high. That is, they will make an internal attribution if the boss is the only person in the workplace who yells at Tori, which is low consensus, if the boss also yells at other employees besides Tori, which is low distinctiveness, and if the boss always yells at Tori, which is high consistency. However, the employees will make an external attribution toward the object of the boss's behavior, which in this case would be because Tori is an overall incompetent employee, when consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency are all high. That is, the employees will blame Tori for the boss's behavior if everyone else in the workplace also yells at Tori, which is high consensus, if the boss only yells at Tori and doesn't yell at any other employees, which is high distinctiveness, and if the boss yells at Tori all the time, which is high consistency. People will make external attributions toward the situation, such as if Tori makes a single dumb error, when there is low consistency. Consensus and distinctiveness can be high or low in this regard. For example, if this is the first time the boss has ever yelled at Tori, employees will most likely blame the boss's behavior on the situation that Tori has caused. Social psychologists find that one of the biggest reasons people make attributions to explain why people, including themselves, have succeeded or failed at something. According to social psychologists, people's attributions of successes or failures depends on two factors: the locus of control and the stability of performance. Locus of control is whether the reason for success or failure is perceived as being due to internal or external factors. For example, arguing that a person succeeded because he was talented is an argument for an internal locus of control, but arguing that a person succeeded because he got lucky is an external locus of control. Stability of performance is whether success or failure is perceived as happening frequently or rarely. For example, if a person does consistently well on her social psychology exams, then her stability of performance is high. However, if a person is inconsistent in how well she performs on her exams, then her stability of performance is low. According to social psychologists, people's perceived locus of control and perceived stability of performances combine into one of four types of attributions for success and failures. When people perceive an external locus of control and stable performances over time, they attribute successes and failures to a person's natural ability or talent. Ability is an internal attribution. When people perceive an external locus of control and stable performances over time, they attribute successes and failures to the task difficulty. This is an external attribution. When people perceive an internal locus of control and unstable performances over time, they attribute successes and failures to the person's effort. This is an internal attribution. Finally, when people perceive an external locus of control and unstable performances over time, they attribute successes and failures to luck. This is an external attribution. For example, Consider a person playing basketball who just made 30 three-pointers in a row, which most people would consider a quite successful performance. People will believe that this person made all these consecutive three-pointers because of his ability if they've seen him do the same thing in the past, and if they believe that he is a talented basketball player. People will believe that this performance is due to task difficulty, that is, they will think that the task is easy, if they don't believe that a person can improve his three-point shooting, and if the person performs the same over time. People will believe that his performance is due to effort, if the person has never shot so many consecutive three-pointers in the past, and believe that he has the ability to improve his performance. Finally, people will believe that these consecutive three-pointers were due to luck if the person has never done this in the past, and if they don't believe that this person has the ability to improve his three-point shooting. How people explain their own successes and failures can have a major impact on their future behavior. For example, if a person attributes poor performance on an exam to the fact that his professor writes exams that are too difficult, then he might not try to do anything to improve himself because of the difficultness of the exam is something beyond his control. However, if he attributes poor performance on an exam to his effort, then he might actually try to improve because effort is unstable, but within his control. Making attributions is by no means a straightforward task. Rather, the attributions that people make are biased by human cognitive processes. Social psychologists have identified a number of these biases, including the fundamental attribution error, perceptual bias, and self-serving bias. One of the biggest biases in making attributions is the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency for people to overestimate the effects of internal factors and underestimate the effects of external factors on people's behavior. In other words, people tend to make internal attributions over external attributions. This is why people often blame people's behavior on internal factors such as willpower, personality, and talent, and tend to ignore situational influences on people's behavior. For example, consider a woman put on a diet by her physician, who people discover eating a piece of chocolate cake in a restaurant. When people see this, they will tend to blame her behavior on her lack of willpower, and ignore situational factors that might have caused her to eat the cake, such as peer pressure from her fellow diners that she should have some cake with them. Another bias in how people make attributions is perceptual bias. Perceptual bias is the tendency to overestimate the causal impact of the people and objects in which people focus their attention. For example, consider the game of football. Even though there are many players on the team, and even though 11 players on each side of the ball are on the field at one time, quarterbacks often get much of the credit for winning and much of the blame for losing. This occurs in large part because of perceptual bias. Because the television camera is often focused on the quarterback during the game, people come to believe that the quarterback has an incredibly large impact on the outcome of the game. People tend to ignore other factors that influence the outcome of the game, such as how well the receivers caught the ball or how well the defense played. The impact of perceptual bias on making attributions was shown in an experiment where the researchers set up a room with two speakers having a conversation with one another, right in the middle here on this slide. The researchers had 6 participants observe the conversation with different lines of vision, again as you can see here. Some of the participants were in direct sight of just one of the conversationalists, and others were in direct sight of both conversationalists. The researchers made sure that each of the conversationalists spoke the same exact amount of time during the conversation. The researchers hypothesized that those who could only see one of the conversationalists at a time would believe that the conversationalist they saw had more influence on the course of the conversation. But those who saw both would believe that both conversationalists had an equal impact on the course of conversation. After the conversation was over, the researchers asked the observers to rate how much of a causal role both of the speakers had on the course of the conversation. As you can see from this graph, the results confirm the researchers' hypothesis. Those who could only see one speaker thought that the speaker that they saw had a more causal impact on the course of the conversation than the other speaker. However, observers who could see both speakers thought that both of the speakers had an equal impact on the course of the conversation. Another bias in making attributions is the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is defining that people tend to make internal attributions for success, but external attributions for failure. In other words, people believe that they succeed because of their innate ability, but that they fail because of external factors such as the difficultness of the task. As they say, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. For example, some social psychologists examine explanations professional athletes gave for winning and losing games. Overwhelmingly, these researchers found that winning teams attribute their successes to their innate ability. However, losing teams attribute their failures to bad luck and the superiority of the other team, both external factors. Also, social psychologists have found that students take credit when they receive an A or a B on an exam, but students who get a C, D, or F often blame the instructor or the exam or other external factors. Throughout the time I've taught this class, I have collected explanations students have given for why they were successful, made a good grade on an exam or a paper assignment. I've also asked students to tell me why they believe they did poorly on some exams or paper assignments. And lo and behold, we see the self-serving bias at play here. Here are some real-life examples of attributions students have given me for doing well on a paper or an exam. All of these are internal attributions. I did well because I studied hard, effort. I was interested in the topic of the paper. Interest, that's internal. I believed in what I was writing about, so it was easy to be passionate about it. Passion, that's an internal attribution. I didn't procrastinate and gave myself enough time to write out my thoughts. Again, effort, scheduling. These are internal attributions. But what do students do when you ask them why they did poorly on an exam or paper assignment? They tend to give you external attributions. I didn't really understand the instructor. Again, blaming the instructor. The instructor wasn't good at explaining the material. That's an external attribution. The material covered in the class wasn't on the test. Again, the external attribution, blaming the professor or the instructor for the disjuncture between the material on the lecture and the material on the test. I didn't develop good study habits in high school. This is blaming the poor performance on the lack of skills acquired during high school training, blaming it on the high school. I didn't have much study time. Again, usually that's an external attribution because of work, family matters, etc.